Okay. Well, good day, everybody. This morning, I'm joined by Len Bunton and Ian Honeyman, who I will ask to introduce himself shortly. And today, we're going to be talking about the best practice guide that was developed a couple of years ago and can be found on the CICV website. Also, you'll find a number of other helpful guidance documents that are all designed to help make the entire process from beginning to end in construction projects much more straightforward. The best practice guide is a very easily read, easily digested document and provides a great deal of useful information to help all stakeholders in a construction project. That's clients, contractors, designers, consultants, suppliers. And it's all about preparing for a successful project, taking time at the beginning before anything starts on site and ensuring that all aspects of the project are understood by the parties, all risks are determined, allocated, priced, and addressed commercially before anything proceeds to the site. So I'm going to now ask Len to introduce himself to you all. Len.
Thanks, David. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Len Bunton, Ian and I have joint chairs of the CICV Payment and Cash Flow Group. And in addition to that, I've spent my lifetime in the industry promoting change and best practice. And most of my professional work at the moment is dealing with payment and cash flow issues. So just a bit of background as to how the best practice guide developed. It really came into being as we got towards the end of the COVID situation, where we began to look at why disputes arise in construction projects. And we got a lot of information by talking to a number of adjudicators throughout the UK. We identified about 40 or 50 reasons why construction disputes arise. I'm sure many of our listeners will know about these. And the intention then was to do something about that, to cut these issues off at the pass. And we brought together about 12 or 13 industry specialists, and we set out a number of recommendations which are included in the best practice guide. And the whole objective of this is to allow you to manage the commercial aspects of projects much more efficiently. There's no doubt in my mind, and I know that Ian supports this, that many of the problems in the industry are self-induced because contractors are not running projects the way they should be. So we want you to buy into this concept, support what we're trying to do, and we'll be going through in a moment more of the recommendations in much more detail. So pass it over to Ian.
Thanks, Len. I'm Ian Honeyman. I'm currently working as a technical and commercial advisor to Scottish Building Federation, having previously been the commercial director at that organisation for a number of years, but I've now stepped back from that, and I'm currently sort of working as and when to help some of the members and others that got into difficulties. And part of that process and such, like as Len said, is looking at what caused most of these particular problems. And the best practice guide tends to deal with the stuff that you would tend to think is kind of basic, but it's not really basic, because if you get the basics wrong, then anything more complicated that comes out of that is going to be more difficult to resolve. So this is about getting the basics right, which forms a platform on which to basically protect yourselves in terms of payment and other aspects of construction issues on projects and such like. So without sort of further ado, I think the intention is today to follow the sort of format of the best practice guide and just touch on a few of the key items that are highlighted in there. And the first one that I'm going to touch on is tender qualifications. Now, it's vital to understand the importance of resolving tender qualifications before entering into a contract. The tendency is for QSs, architects, employers simply to state that no tender qualifications are going to be accepted, otherwise your tender will be void. Now that's a fairly basic statement, but there are main reasons where you have to think about why a qualification might be required. But the point of putting a qualification in is it makes it more difficult for the person that's evaluating that tender to actually do so on a sort of even platform. So it's important that where qualifications are felt necessary, it's probably better that some of these things are raised early during the tender process rather than waiting until submitting the tender and putting it in, because if it's an issue that's affecting you, it may well be seen that it's going to affect others, and sometimes this is taken as a method of saying, well, this is maybe an advantage that I can have. But if you base your tender on that advantage and then the advantage is taken away, it's kind of pointless exercise, to be perfectly honest, because you've then got the situation whereby I've put a qualification in, I've priced my tender on that basis, suddenly that qualification is removed and my tender may still stand. You've got a decision to make as to whether you want to live with that, with the potential consequences of it, or potentially end up withdrawing your tender on your own, and all that time and effort you've put to is going to waste. So it's probably better that any qualification you feel necessary to probably deal with issues that maybe the documentation isn't quite as clear as the person intended it to be, is raised during that process of pricing the work, and ask for clarification, which can be then sent out to all parties in the tendering process, and thus allowing you to then get a clear steer as to what you should be pricing rather than what you think you should be pricing. If a qualification is submitted by the contractor and he's asked to withdraw it, ultimately that's a decision that the contractor will have to make as to whether or not withdrawing that qualification means that the tender they're going in at is higher risk, or whether or not they can live with that risk. Decisions to be made, but ultimately you've created a problem by flagging up something, and if you haven't covered that off in your own analysis or assessment of the risk and it's removed, then you're putting yourself in a more difficult position going forward, and the client and the QS, because they've got to deal with that issue going forward at some point. So hopefully that gives a wee bit of guidance as to what's in there. There's a wee bit more detail in the actual document itself, so if you go on to read that, you'll pick up these other points.
Thanks, Ian. I think a key point that you've raised there is about the transparency around what is being submitted, because clearly when a tender and all of the associated documents are issued, there's a great deal of work has been undertaken to create what the client and the client's advisors feel is the appropriate risk and commercial balance that's then been issued for pricing. If the contractor wishes to amend what has been put there, then as you say, there is a risk that the difficulty which that presents is, of course, how that will be evaluated against other tenders. So presumably the advice would be that price what you have been issued with, but if as a contractor or a tenderer you feel there may be a different way of approaching that, by all means provide a qualification, but it has to be presented against a fully priced submission against the original requirements.
Absolutely, David. Yeah, I mean, as I say, that's why sometimes if you've got a query or an aspect of it, asking the client for clarification on it might give you a better understanding, but generally speaking, you should price the document you've got, warts and all, to a certain extent. As I say, and if there are fundamental problems with that tender documentation that come to light afterwards, then the contractor as well as the client's then got to deal with the consequences of that. But you're right, you should price the document that's in place. And as I say, because putting in qualifications, you might think you're bringing something to the table that's beneficial to the client, and might be beneficial to you, but that's not necessarily what's going to be looked at in the round at the evaluation stage. It may be taken into account somewhere along the line, but it's not necessarily presented on a level playing field with others, so it can cause complications. So
in a similar vein, Len, contract amendments.
Yeah, well, that is the bane of the industry and has been for many times. And just as an aside, I want to mention that the Conflict Avoidance Coalition now has a group of people looking at the whole issue of contract amendments, particularly amending the standard forms, and are now beginning to challenge public and private sector clients as to why they're trying to impose onerous conditions into the contracting fraternity. And one of our other organisations in CICV is the finishes and interiors sector, and they offer their members a contract review service, which is very cost effective. It will take somebody a couple of hours to go through a contract that you've got into tender, to highlight any high risk clauses, draw these to your attention, explain these to you, and then you have three options. Number one, you can try and negotiate these out, or you can try and get them softened a bit. But if the risk that you're taking on is really onerous, then you've got the option just to walk away. And a number of people we've been working with have said to the main contractor and the client, I'm very sorry, we're not going to accept these conditions, go and find somebody else. And we had a situation recently where a main contractor said to a client, okay, we will find somebody else. And 2 weeks later, he was back knocking on their door and saying, we can't find anybody else. We're going to give you the subcontract and we're going to take these amendments out. So the sort of things you want to be looking for are amendments to the payment terms, the notice provisions. We're going to come on and talk to that in a bit more detail. Ridiculous clauses like imposing on a £500,000 contract liquidate damages at £25,000 a week. The damages are completely disproportionate to the value of your works. Extending the retention period, your final retention will be paid on 12 or 24 months after practical completion of the main contract, that sort of thing. Variation clauses which get tweaked to certainly don't suit you as a part of the supply chain. And some absolutely absurd clauses that we read last week, where there was a provision in the contract that said, we're providing you with ground engineering reports, ground conditions, blah, blah, blah. And by the way, if you find anything at all on the site that is not covered by these reports, then that's your responsibility. It is just ludicrous. So the main thing is to make sure that you go through the contract, you identify the risk clauses or get some help to do that, factor these into your tender, or get into a position where you can sit down and have a sensible talk with the main contractor or the client and get these amendments removed. The one thing you cannot do is simply ignore the contract. You have to look at it, because you could be walking into a disaster zone that you can put yourself out of business in a very worst case scenario. So this again is another example of where the industry has got to do a bit of work to help itself. So contract amendments, very important. And again, go into the BPG and you'll see how we've fleshed out some of the situations that you might experience.
Thanks very much, Len. I think it really does highlight the need to ensure that every aspect of every document that is issued to you has to be read, fully understood, and the implications of whatever is in the contract have to be priced accordingly. Every item in the contract will carry with it a commercial implication, and entering into a construction project without fully understanding what every one of those words means for all parties is, of course, as you say, very, very treacherous territory. The next item in the best practice guide is about pre-start meetings. Len, you're going to talk about the importance of these.
Yeah, again, I think it's very important. It's an opportunity for you to thrash out all of the issues that are going to affect your performance on the contract. And one of the things is absolutely critical is you ensure that you get a full set of minutes after that, and you read these and make sure the issues that you brought up at these pre-start meetings have been dealt with. So it's an opportunity to clear the air, really, and to make sure everybody's pointing in the right direction. Make sure, as I say, that you get sort of that meeting so that you're absolutely clear on what your liabilities and responsibilities are, because they will be referred to. You'll find later on somebody will say, well, go back to the pre-start meetings and you'll see that an issue was raised and you didn't raise it at that time, so you're absolutely stuck with it. So again, the best practice guide will give you 9 or 10 different scenarios that you might want to be looking at. It's a very important part of the pre-tender acceptance process as well. Thanks, David.
But the other thing, of course, is that a construction project, like any project, requires a great deal of team interaction. So it is an important opportunity to start that whole bonding process that will need to be in place as everybody gets into the trenches and cracks on through the project. The next item is an interesting one, contractor design portions. And I remember when I started out in my career as a QS a long time ago, the extent of contractor design portions was generally limited to very specialist areas of work that required to be pushed down the supply chain, if you like, to the appropriate area of expertise that could actually deal with the design of that particular element of the works. But I think over the years we've seen the extent to which this process has been expanded quite considerably, in some cases because it's been pushed down the supply chain, because further up the supply chain there perhaps isn't the fee to fully design elements, but that we have come across instances of that. But at the same time, it is a useful facility to call on the appropriate skill at the appropriate level. Ian, do you want to talk to that particular point?
Yeah, I think you've highlighted the nub of this whole thing. Is in the past it probably wasn't a huge part of the contract, but now it's become kind of the norm to have contractor design elements of it. And I think there's nothing particularly wrong with that, provided it's tackled in the correct manner and people are brought in at the earliest opportunity. I think because the fundamental point about it is that the contractor is effectively taking on the design responsibility and the risks and such like that goes with that. So that's main contractor, subcontractor, etc. And it's just basically transferring the risk that would normally be undertaken or covered by the principal designer. Now, the principal designer still has a responsibility in all this stuff, but the big issue and such like with contractor design portions are that sometimes the elements are designed in isolation, which is the fundamental flaw that comes into this, because they're not intended to be designed in isolation. They have to be designed in connection with the whole, and it's the integration of that design into the whole design that's key and critical, because generally where things go wrong, it's the interface between the two and the lack of thought processes and such like that can create anomalies in that area, which can completely derail the progress on a job and such like. And probably don't come, when they do come home to roost, they come home to roost at the least the worst time in the job, when it's being built, rather than when it would have been otherwise being thought about at the design stage. So any of these particular aspects that are classified as contractor design, I think it's important to realise that the contractor who's going to be designing that bit, whether it's a main contractor, a subcontractor, or what, is involved at the earliest opportunity. The nature of the beast tends to be that they're involved during the build process. Maybe the M&E slightly is brought in slightly earlier than that, but again, it tends to be once the main contractor is appointed and the subcontractors are then being brought on board, that's when the bulk of the design work happens, and that, to my mind, is probably a fundamental flaw in projects of that nature, because you're squeezing things into a tighter space, and the issues and such like are going to be brought to the table when people can least afford it. And obviously that can have impact on program, it can have impact on cost, it can have impact on all sorts of stuff. But in any event, if you're asked as a contractor or subcontractor to take on the design responsibility, you have to know from the very outset as to what your responsibilities are going to be, what the extent and nature of that design is going to be, and agree it at the tender stage if possible, because ultimately that's what you're putting your price together on. And it becomes more difficult to add in things on a design basis when you're supposed to have covered all that particular aspect in your price, etc. So it's obvious that anything to do with that design side of things changes to it again when it's part of a subcontract or a subcontract package. You've got to basically make sure that any instructions that are coming are covered, and is it a variation, is it something you should have allowed for? All these particular aspects become on and take on a significant more sort of responsible is not necessarily the word, take on a bit more detailed issue in terms of your overall responsibility for the job, because something that may seem small could be big if it's wrong. The other aspect that you obviously need to think about is you need to obviously have in place the particular insurances you're being asked to, and sometimes that particular aspect can be quite problematic in the job, because as we all know, the cost of insurances, particularly PI insurances, is going through the roof, and sometimes the size of the package that you might be designing may be smaller than the cost of the lumen insurance you're being asked to do, but nonetheless your part of the design could have a significant impact. So these particular aspects have got to be thought about and considered when you're doing all this stuff. But as I say, communication, and as you say, part of working as a team is critical for that this aspect to be a success on a project, because if you don't have that communication and lines of communication with up and down the chain, then there can be major issues.
I think, Ian, it's worth reiterating a point that you made there. It's the interface. Contractor A is designing one element, contractor B is designing another element. They do it to very high standard. The design is absolutely spot on, but it's when these two elements come together and the responsibility for that integration is so important. The other thing that you mentioned there was about insurances, and just picking up on the previous topic we were covering there was contract amendments, and we're now hearing that certain insurance providers are looking more closely at contract amendments, and in the past insurance providers would be asking what form of contract am I expected to cover, or standard form. But then when they see there's 3 or 4 pages of amendments, they're realising that the risk profile has changed so much that they're not prepared to provide insurance cover. So again, it's a high risk strategy when a standard form of contract developed over many years with many experts providing input is then significantly amended. You clear the dangers of that. Len, do you want to come in on the contractor design and then perhaps take us into the next topic, design liability?
Yeah, well, again, this is a really major issue developing, and I'm particularly seeing that through the work we do with the finishes and interiors sector, where there's no doubt about it. The employer or the contractor is endeavouring to put more design responsibility onto the supply chain. And just to give an example, I looked at a contract last week which had 10 different clauses relating to design obligations within it. They were scattered right through the document, and each one of them imposed different obligations. And I actually phoned up the client and said, I've just read this clause, I don't understand it. And he said, no, I've read it as well, and I don't understand it either, but I'll ask our lawyers what it means. And what we have done recently in a situation was to sit with the main contractor and the client and get an absolutely clear agreement on what the supply chain's design responsibility is in a project, face to face, and then get that set out in paper so that you know exactly what your obligations are. And I think Ian touched on this. I think over the years we've seen a counterbalance effect. As professional fees, designers' fees have gone down, the level of obligations on the supply chain for contractors' design has increased. And you sometimes see tender documents with 13 or 14 different contractor design packages. So the answer is to get it sorted from the outset. And David is spot on talking about interface. How does the contractor's design fit in with the architect's design and the rest of the building? These have all got to be thrashed out. Another clause that's worming its way into is to say that you are responsible for the entire design. If the architect has designed something and you've got to develop that design, clauses are saying you've actually got to take responsibility for what the architect has designed and make it work. And as David mentioned, and Ian, passing this to your insurers is absolutely critical, because you could end up finding that you don't have insurance. And I think all of this is going to become of much more significant as we see the post-Grenfell impact of building regulations and defective workmanship and all of that stuff, being absolutely sure that you're bang on in relation to know what your responsibilities are. So I think it's a major problem for the industry. As to how we get round that, professional fees have got to come back to a sensible level. As to whether that will happen, given the current government's position on spending, I doubt very much. But it's now all been dumped on contractors. So be wary. That's my message.
Thanks, Len. Some really important messages there that do indicate the status of the industry and the risks that prevail at the moment. Ian, anything else you would like to raise on design liability?
Yeah, well, I mean, the design liability side of things is, you've got things that are classified as prescriptive, which you must be followed. And then you've got descriptive, which basically means you're being expected, as Len was touching on there, to expand on the design that's currently there. Each of these things have got their own scenarios that can pan out if you don't do what you're being asked to do. So it's important that you understand what it is you're being asked to do. And again, that comes back to the basics about reading and understanding the contract that you're given and taking on board what's actually written down there, because to assume something is a fatal flaw. And as Len says, if you've not read that and you haven't passed that to your insurers, doing something wrong can have significant consequences way beyond what the scope of the works that you might have actually done. But it's also understanding who's actually responsible for the design coordination, because ultimately, whilst you might have a responsibility to design the particular package, as we've touched on, the interfaces between the packages and such like are there. Now, sometimes, and you would like to think that you would get to speak to the other subcontractors who have got a link in with you. If it was done properly, is probably the right way to go, and it should be done with the principal designer taking an overview on all this sort of stuff at the same time, so that they see that the packages that are getting pulled together are basically aligning with the intent that the original concept design had, and you're not doing something in isolation that's going to fall apart when it gets on the site and such like. So I think, as I say, communication is fundamental, but it's understanding what that design liability is and where it can take you. And one of the aspects that I've seen in the past is where contractors may not even have any design responsibility in the original job, but are asked to comment or suggest or come up with a solution to something, because practically they're best placed to do that. And they think, yeah, we can do that, that's not a problem. And they go ahead and they produce a solution, and on paper it looks great until suddenly it doesn't. And all of a sudden that responsibility becomes the contractor's, because you've effectively introduced an element of design and you weren't necessarily being asked to, but that's basically what you've done, and you inherit the consequences of that going down the chain. And that's something that happens on a regular basis on small projects, whether there's any design or not. Ultimately, if you do something that's you weren't asked to do, or you were asked for advice on, or something like that, you could be effectively taking on a design responsibility and not really understanding that's what it is. And when something goes wrong, that's what it'll probably lead back to. You made a conscious decision on it. So it's the liability side of things is not just about whether you have a design things. You could be taking on a liability that you didn't realise because of your actions on a job. So just to be aware of that, that's one of the things that I think is probably
absolutely
key.
Yeah, Len, you must come across this all the time in your work, where disputes arise simply because where the liability and responsibility sits has not been clear.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on how that can be improved?
It's communication, as Ian has said, getting it sorted from the outset. What am I expected to do to provide here? That's, and it's got to be face to face. One of the big problems in the industry is there's far too much electronic communication between people. Have sessions like this, sit down with who you're involved with and get it right from the outset. You have absolute clarity. And that's why I see in adjudications, so the main contractor saying, no, it's their responsibility, and the subby saying, no, it's not. Where is it? And the guy says, it's in page 96, written in the smallest font I can possibly provide, where it says, you're responsible for the whole design here. And the guy said, well, I didn't read that. Well, that's your problem. So get it sorted. That's the message to everybody listening to this.
And the other thing, of course, when contractors or subcontractors are being asked to contribute to the design or take responsibility for design, their input surely must be more valuable at the design stage, because when the project is being designed, if it needs that specialist expertise, which clearly was the original intention of contractor design portions, then surely that expertise has to be deployed at the design stage. And the later it is actually introduced, the less effective, and of course less effective it will be, and of course introduces the risk that the understanding as to who's responsible for this.
Yeah, I agree with that.
That leads us neatly into, we're talking about communication there, into notices. Len.
Well, again, this has been a massive problem for the industry. And one of the things the listeners here need to look at is, what are the notice provisions in the contract? What do they say? When are you supposed to submit a notice? What do you need to put in it, and who do you need to send it to? It's as simple as that. And I've been involved in many adjudications where lawyers for a respondent has said the referring party's claim fails here, Mr. Bunton, because they didn't submit a notice in accordance with the contract, or they sent it to the wrong person. And sometimes you'll see a notice provision that says you have to send it to the commercial manager, you have to send it to the head of legal services, you have to send it to the site. It's got to be sent by recorded post, or it's to be sent to somebody who's got a tent on the top of Mount Everest, to make it, just to give you a ludicrous example. And if you don't follow these notice provisions, then your goose will be cooked. So it's very important when you start a contract that the commercial managers and the contract managers understand who they've got to communicate with, and follow that principle. And one of the things we're developing with contractors are template notices. So you've got all the addresses on it. They will write out what the purpose of the notice is, either a delay or a variation or something, and it goes to the right person at the right time, and it's sent under the right way. And believe me, in the current times at the moment where cash is king, people are going to come up with all sorts of excuses not to pay you. So again, this is another example in this discussion of being absolutely bulletproof and make sure you're fully compliant with what the contract says.
Yeah, I think it's already been mentioned about don't assume anything. Don't assume that somebody knows what how they're expected to perform or communicate. It has to be captured, written down, discussed, agreed, and then everybody can move on the same page. And Ian, anything you want to add in on notices?
No, I mean, obviously, I suppose the notice side of things comes into where there's standard terms and such like under the standard conditions of contract there. Sometimes if you get amendments which change that notice period and make it more difficult, or shorten the periods and such like, that can become problematic. But I'm thinking predominantly along the lines of payment notices and such like that, where, ultimately you can fall foul because the timing element, if you get it wrong, you get it wrong, and it's black and white. There may be all sorts of reasons why you got it wrong, but the fact is you got it wrong, and that's all that the unfortunate person in the curly wig would look at and say, well, you didn't meet the date, as Len says, and once that happens, all the arguments and everything else that you've got that you might have justification for just fall away. So it's basically what we said at the outset. The information in the best practice guide is basic common sense stuff to do, and you have to do it, because if you follow that, then you've got a chance of at least pushing things forward beyond that. If you get these things wrong, these basics wrong, then everything else becomes a little bit more problematic.
I remember when the best practice guide was coming together, one of the things that we wanted to achieve was the simplicity of the narrative. And as you say, the one thing that runs through it all is just common sense. And in some respects, reading it, someone might say, well, yeah, but we know that's all very well. It doesn't necessarily mean it's being applied. So
no, I think you've got to think about the reason that Len and such like and others that are operating in the area that we see disputes. The reason these disputes are happening is because this stuff is not being done the way it should be getting done. And despite it is what you would think, well, that's common sense, we should do that. It just doesn't happen all the time. And unfortunately, I mean, a lot of the time it does, but when it's into dispute, these are the things that come out.
Yeah. Now, the next item we could spend all day talking about. Unfortunately, we don't have all day, but payment schedules and payment applications. Ian, do you want to lead off on this one?
Yeah, I mean, the payment provisions under the contract, most of them are pretty clear and straightforward in them, albeit there are slight variations, etc., across the different range of contracts that there. But the principle of them is there are dates by which you need to set from the very outset in terms of the starting process, valuation, due dates, etc., etc. The fundamental thing about creating a payment schedule is it basically then sets out a set of dates that you can follow regularly and everybody knows what they're working to. Some people don't agree with them because of peculiarities in the contracts in terms of the odd date, how do you count these things, etc., etc. But generally speaking, if you follow the principle of setting these dates out, ultimately the dates will be there. So there'll be an application date, a due date, final date for payment, and the dates by which payment notices and pay less notices are effectively due to be issued in order to comply with the contract. Now, those dates and such like will be determined by what's in the contract or any amendments to that contract. And as long as you've read and understand that and set the schedule out, that to my mind is a sort of basically that's setting that principle for the rest of the job going forward. And that's obviously up and down the chain. That's basically main contractor to employer and main contractor subcontractor relationships and such like. So that's all in there. And it's important that you stick to these dates and follow them, because if you don't, again, applications can be rejected and payments and such like final dates for payments all go out the window, and that massively impacts on cash flow. So again, I think that you'll find in the best practice guide there's a sort of template for that we've kind of produced. It's useful. There are critics of it, but my philosophy and such like, it's a good starting point, and it's a good to keep these dates in place because you've got a platform on which to build from.
It's a good discipline indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. I say we could go on about what's involved in that, but I think it's one of the fundamentals about getting this thing right. The dates and such like, you know what you've got to have your application, know when you've got to issue the payment notice, know when you've got to issue pay less notice, and you know when you're going to get, more importantly, when you're going to get paid.
Yeah, Glenn, do you want to pick up on this, because I know that in your work, one of the main topics will be around payment disputes, and then perhaps you could lead us into the next item, which is variations.
Yeah, well, this is a factor in my life every day at the moment, Ian, David, just dealing with payment problems. And sadly, one of the things I've often got to tell people who say I'm not getting paid is, well, I'm afraid you're not getting paid because you're not entitled to be paid, because number one, as Ian has said, you've missed the payment dates in the payment schedule. Another big factor is you're not getting paid because you haven't substantiated your application for payment. And just to give you a simple example, you're on a project, you're doing plasterboarding, and you say the work is 85% complete. It goes into the contractor's QS or the PQS, and he says, no, it's only 60% complete, and puts his red pen through it. Now, you've got to support your application with detailed evidence, photographs or whatever, marked up drawings. You've got to make sure, I'm going to use the word bulletproof again, you've got to make sure that your payment application will stand up to scrutiny, because it will get clobbered if you don't do that. So in addition to meeting the dates, which Ian has quite rightly pointed out, substantiate what you're actually claiming. The other thing just to mention, this ridiculous expression in the industry about smash and grab adjudications, it conjures up a picture of me standing outside a jeweller's shop with a mask on and a brick, and I'm throwing a brick through the window and grabbing the loot and doing a runner. And it's a ridiculous expression because all you're doing with these adjudications is following the requirements of the contract. And if somebody on the other side doesn't issue a payment notice or a pay less notice, then they're going to get stung. They're going to have to pay the amount of your application and then fight it out at a later date with a true value adjudication. And it's a complete waste of time and energy in the industry. So any QSs that are listening to this, get yourself sorted out, hit the dates, substantiate your application for payment. Another thing that I quite often experience, and Ian and I have discussed this, in the good old days, you would send your valuation in, you'd phone up the QS the next day and say, can I pop round and go over our application? That doesn't happen, or the other person deliberately doesn't make contact with you. And a few weeks later, you get a payment notice in and find that your application is only 50% of what you've claimed. So I think commercial managers have got to be much more proactive in engaging with whoever is evaluating your application and making sure that they are happy with what has been put in and they're not going to shred it. So that's down to the industry. It's another one of the reasons why we produced this document. It's down to the industry to get its act together, David.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And we've mentioned quite a few instances this morning around record keeping, which is actually a heading in its own right in the best practice guide. Len, do you want to just, I suppose, reiterate the importance of very robust record keeping?
Yeah, well, it's absolutely vital, and we're working with a number of people at the moment to ensure that their day-to-day records in the project are absolutely bang on. I'm a great believer in photographic evidence. I'm a great believer in video evidence. I'm a great believer, for example, and I know this is a pain in the neck, of contractors printing out email communications and get them filed. Because when I walk into an organisation 2 years after a job's finished, David, you find the commercial team that were on the project have left. There's no electronic records. Nobody knows where anything is. So it's absolutely vital to make sure that you're keeping daily tabs on what's going on. And one of the big things you need to keep records of is disruption, where you can't get into areas because there are people working or there's materials all over the shop. And one of the best bits of kit I have seen is a camera that slots onto somebody's helmet, and they go into a room, take photographs, and then send them by email to the site manager or the main contractor and say, look, we can't get into this room today. We're going to have to put the lads somewhere else. And these are all very helpful because, believe you me, 2 or 3 years down the line, when you're chasing a lot of money, if your records are not there, your case will fail. And it's probably one of the biggest reasons why people are not successful in adjudication, because they don't have the backup. So keep everything, make sure it's properly filed, make sure it's accessible. People move on. Sometimes people leave organizations under a cloud and are not going to help you. Sometimes people will be around to help you, but by and large, the reliance is on written records. So Ian and I have discussed this at endless times. I'm sure we're both on the same page on this one, Ian.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, effectively, the records that you're keeping, you're not keeping them for the purposes of having a dispute, but you're keeping them there on the basis if you ever get into a dispute, you can effectively justify what's going on. But if you don't keep them, then you've got nothing there to back up. But I think there's a wee bit more nuance and such, like in terms of the records and the type of records we're keeping now, because it touches on other aspects that we'll probably touch on shortly in terms of quality and all the rest of the stuff, because those records can be used for so many different things and other things as well. So it is very important.
One of the key pieces of advice there that I picked up just in the chat there was what would happen if you invited somebody in who knew nothing about the project? Where would they go to find the facts, the details, the records, the minutes? All of the items that will have a significant influence on how, if it is a dispute, how that will turn out. So it's again, it's common sense, but it does have to be stated. Another item that, again, we could talk all day about is quality and defects. Ian, do you want to lead us into that one?
Yeah, well, obviously, our industry, in some respects, only gets a reputation for things that are going to go wrong. I mean, and yet there are loads and loads of projects out there that get done and they're fantastic, and you don't hear so much about them. You hear about the bad ones, but when you hear about the bad ones, they're really bad. And I think when you look at some of these sort of things, you begin to wonder, how did we get here? And basically, the principle of it is all about making sure that when you're building stuff, you've got the information that you require in the first place in order to build things properly, but also that you have people who are competent and capable of building things as intended, and you check and verify it on your own. You've basically got to take responsibility as a contractor for the stuff that you do. And that's not just you and your own operatives, it's your subcontractors. Everybody that's building these things has to take a degree of responsibility and put in place some methods of checking. And I think obviously post Grenfell and a few other things that say that the Edinburgh schools and the like, it's becoming more and more that the contractors are now taking records of how and what's been built, as I say, photographic efforts, video efforts, purely and simply to say, well, this is how we built stuff, because the finished article might look quite good, but what's behind the finished article could be fundamentally flawed. And it's only when something goes wrong that you suddenly take things apart and someone says, well, we need to open that up. And you open it up and you find, how's that? How could anybody do that? If you've got photographs and videos and such like of it being built, then you can at least be confident when if something ever does go wrong, well, we've done our bit to try and stop that from happening. So I think it's about people taking responsibility, contractors take responsibility, but also the information and quality of the information, how that information is basically transferred from design to the contractor is as important and as clear as possible. But as I say, it's been an issue that we've had for a long time, and as I say, sometimes it's time and sometimes it's money that things get done shortcuts. Ultimately, none of that's an excuse. Everything has to be, you've been tasked to build something in accordance with the drawings, the contract. That's what you're going to do. If you don't do that, it's on you. So you want to make sure you protect yourself, is have processes in which way you can check it, verify it, and keep records of it.
One of the consequences of the push for more sustainable buildings and net zero is quite a significant growth in the number of passive house projects that are being built, particularly in the education sector. And in the programme that I was running, one of the things that we found was that the quality outcomes were enhanced because of the level of scrutiny and oversight by the passive house certifier. And it gets me thinking, are we going to see a return to the days of the clerk of works? I'm working on a third sector project on behalf of the client, and we brought in a clerk of works to provide that oversight and scrutiny that hopefully will benefit everybody in the long term. So maybe that's something that we might see a return to that in time.
Quite possibly, David. Quite possible.
So the final item, Len, I'm going to ask you to talk about the conflict avoidance process, which you must be very pleased at the progress of this over the last few years. Do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, and yes, I'm very pleased at the progress of this and had phenomenal support for this throughout the industry. The conflict avoidance process is early intervention on projects to prevent issues that arise escalating into disputes. It's as simple as that. And anybody listening to this will know that day-to-day issues arise in projects. And sometimes you can get these resolved with the guys on site, or sometimes you can't, and they get escalated. And then you end up going down an adjudication route. And believe me, going down an adjudication route on a live contract is fatal to relationships. People never recover from it. So what's happened is the Conflict Avoidance Coalition now comprises nearly 100 different organisations and people throughout the United Kingdom, from public and private sector clients, the trade organisations, the professional institutions, some very big clients like Transport for London, Network Rail, the Environment Agency. The Scottish Government have been very supportive of the conflict avoidance process. And what we're asking people to do is to sign the Conflict Avoidance Pledge. And you can find that at conflictavoidance.org. And that then allows you to send out a message to the people that you're working with that we're a good business to work with. We don't want to fall out with you. If issues arise in projects, then we will work together to resolve that. And we're gradually seeing conflict avoidance provisions being built into construction contracts. NEC have just issued a new amendment, and discussions with JCT at the moment on the same thing, but encouraging a number of clients to incorporate these into their conditions. And some of the people I'm working with, we're saying to the other side, we want to have this conflict avoidance process in, and so far everybody's been very supportive of that. Some of the construction organisations are bringing their supply chain in and say, we want you to sign up to this. And if issues arise, then we will get these resolved. If you can't get them resolved, the long term is that an industry specialist will be brought in to help you get these resolved and make a series of non-binding recommendations. And I've done a number of these. It's been a case of finding out what the problem is and working constructively with the parties to try to find a constructive solution to the problem. Most of these things will come back to money one way or the other. We had a case recently where my recommendation was that a subcontractor should be paid for something. And the subcontractor and the main contractor did some value engineering and shaved some money off other elements of the project that allowed the subcontractor to be paid, and they moved on. So there's no doubt about it. This is one of the biggest examples of collaboration in the industry. 750 organisations have signed the pledge. That is a drop in the ocean. We should be talking about 25 to 30,000 organisations. It's down to the industry and anybody listening to this to say, I like that. I'm going to have that into our contracts. What I would like to say is that it's worth visiting the website. You can see good examples of where this has worked in practice. It's been very interesting recently. The Environment Agency had a conference. I think they had 150 contractors at it, and they said to them, in the nicest possible way, we want you to sign the pledge. And there was an underlying statement, really, that if you don't sign the pledge, well, we'll be looking for somebody else to put on the tender list. Why would David and Ian, why would you not want a process like this? When are we going to stop eroding hundreds of millions of pounds out of the construction industry in legal fees, court cases, consultants, adjudicators? When are we going to stop doing this and reinvest that money into construction projects? It is crazy. I mean, if you look at the Housing Grants Act came into play about 27 years ago, we now have an industry of lawyers, and I'm not blaming the lawyers, by the way. We have an industry of lawyers who specialise in nothing but adjudication. And it's costing the industry an absolute packet. It is absolutely crazy. You're both nodding your heads. So I'm going to shut
here.
I was going to say, Len, I remember back at the very early days of CAP, and I described it as it's like putting on a seatbelt. You just put it on and you forget about it. And it's the same as, including or signing the CAP pledge and including CAP in the standard form of contracts, because it doesn't cost you anything if everything's fine. You just put it into the contract and you forget about it. But what it does do, and I think we've all seen this at the collective meetings that take place every month, is it's a shift in the culture and attitude towards the whole construction process, recognizing that the more that you can do at the outset to avoid a conflict or a dispute happening later, it benefits everybody. I mean, again, common sense, it goes without saying, but the CAP process is something that is very, well, as somebody once said to me about a driving license, it's very easily carried about. And maybe that's a message for today. I'm very conscious of time. Can I just ask Len and Ian for some final words, and then we can bring the session to an end?
Yeah, well, if I go first, if you don't mind, I've got 3 takeaways. Number 1, go onto the CICV website and you'll find the best practice guide, and you'll find a series of guidance notes that we've produced in respect of this. We've developed some of the recommendations. We can also provide a slide presentation. I would like to see, if there's businesses listening to this, inject into your business the recommendations in the best practice guide. Follow these through and sign the conflict avoidance pledge. And I'm sure, and we feel confident with some of the businesses they've been working with that have adopted the recommendations in here, the quality of their business has improved dramatically. And in a couple of cases, they've found that the level of payment problems that they've had has reduced greatly. So this has been a great opportunity to do this with 2 people that I admire and respect and have become great friends of mine over the last 10 years working together in the industry. So that's my message, David, to our listeners.
Thanks very much, Len, and thanks for your wise words today. Ian?
Yeah, well, I'll keep mine simple. Basically, read and understand the contract that's put in front of you. If you do that, pick out the things that are highlighted in the best practice guidance, such like look at those areas in particular, you will set off in the manner which you want to continue. But basically, read and understand the contract that's in front of you, generally.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks very much, gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you working on these really interesting issues. And as Len says, go to the CICV website where you'll get more information, and you'll find us on LinkedIn if you want to pick up on anything else. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. Goodbye.
Cheers.